Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone who has joined us or is going to join us. I have the distinct pleasure today of having a podcast commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions. It's a conversation with a dear friend and esteemed colleague, Adel Iskandar. I first wish to acknowledge we're in Vancouver, Canada, and we live and work on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish and the Musqueam nations. I'm grateful for them for the fact that they have endured suffering and allowed us to still coexist and be here. Perhaps we can learn a great deal from the First Nations. Uh, Moving on, this is a series of podcasts and conferences organized by the ICDD, which is the International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue. It has been formed to express the needs of the peoples in the midst of crises. The principles and commitments of ICDD speak to the pursuit of peace, human rights, social justice, economic equality, and saving the environment. If you're interested to know more about the ICDD, you can visit the website at www.icdd.info. With that, I would like to begin the conversation with Adel Iskandar. Adel Iskandar is a Middle East media scholar, post-colonialist theorist, analyst, and professor at the Simon Fraser University at the School of Communications. He's more importantly a wonderful and humble human being, and he has a witty and amazing sense of humor. Adil has published a number of books on the topic. The first and foremost of his books,
That's Wadood.
The Al Jazeera, the story of the network that is rattling governments and redefining modern journalism. He wrote this while he was a PhD student, and it is a seminal book, and it has become a reference in the field and on that particular station. And we'll have some aspect to discuss today as well about it. Shortly after the revolution in 2013, Adil published a collection of essays, Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution. He has also been a co-editor of 3 volumes, one on Edward Said, A Legacy of Emancipation and Representation, another on Mediating the Arab Uprising in 2012, and last but not least, Media Evolution on the Eve of the Arab Spring. I am truly privileged to have Adil here. And without further ado, Adil, welcome, marhaba. Very pleased to have you. Very pleased for everyone to join us.
Thank you, Wadood.
If if I can ask everyone, if they don't mind, to keep their mics on mute, we will begin the conversation. You are more than welcome to send us questions, comments as we go along, and we'll be happy to go through them. After we finish the conversation, we can talk on forever, but we'll have a time limit, don't worry. We'll also address a number of these questions or comments that you send us. So Adil, thank you again.
Thank you.
Uh, and we're coming up to the 10th anniversary, December 17th, when we had a Tunisian self-immolate in a small town in Tunisia, and a number uh, demonstrations erupted, and then a great deal has happened ever since. Would you care to tell the viewers and the listeners how it all started in Tunisia and subsequently in Egypt, and then we can go through the underlying causes and what have you?
Sure, sure. Thank you first and foremost, Wadood, for the very kind and very generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be in conversation with you today. Not the least of which is because you're a dear friend and colleague and someone who has a very acute understanding of the political and social and economic circumstances of what's happening in the region. And you also are very, very witty. So hopefully the revolutions will hopefully, trigger that aspect of the discussion as well. The question that you pose about the opening salvo of the Tunisian revolution is really quite important because of the iconic nature of this transformative process. Tunisia in 2010 was, for the most part, identified by the United Nations and the World Bank and the IMF as one of the fastest growing economies when it comes to macroeconomic indicators. So all the metrics seem to indicate that Tunisia is doing fairly well. However, what belied all of this was a deep sort of disparagement and a deep division in society that was swelling and dwelling quite substantially. And I know that we're going to get into the precursors of that, so I don't want to preface it with this statement, but nevertheless, one of the really sort of iconic moments of the revolution was when Hamad Bouazizi, a young vegetable seller in Sidi Bouzid, decided, out of protest and also complete helplessness, if you will, at the status quo. He had not been issued a permit that allows him to sell legally his produce in the public market, and was confronted in a humiliating way by an officer or someone who was responsible for ensuring that that only those with the permits can sell. In that act of public humiliation and in the loss of revenue and the complete disparagement of his predicament, he decided to pour gasoline on himself and self-immolate in front of the equivalent of a city hall in Sidi Bouzid. And that act of revolt, but also it was really very startling in some respects, triggered a series of protests that began on the part of labor and trade unions based and leftist organizations based in Sidi Bouzid. And of course, the backdrop is all the socioeconomic circumstances that we'll get into, but nevertheless, that became a very critical sort of turning point. Mohamed Bouazizi was hospitalized, but the protests continued in front of City Hall, day in, day out, and with very sort of grainy footage circulating of the protests, making their way into satellite television networks, or at least in online spaces on Twitter and Facebook and elsewhere. People began to become increasingly galvanized by it, and out of an expression of solidarity and sympathy with him, we started seeing a swelling of similar protests by similar organizations across Tunisia. Starting with the rural areas and then slowly making their way to Tunis, the capital. I think it's important also to note that prior to that, just prior, in fact, WikiLeaks, which was then sort of a fairly important contributor to our understanding of regime consolidation and capitalist exploitation, had just released at least 20,000 documents outlining corruption in various places in the world and the concentration of capital. Some of those dealt specifically with the Tunisian situation, Tunisian circumstance, including nepotism within the ruling family of Ben Ali and his wife and their family as well. So with Tunisians seeing that incredible disparity that they're experiencing in relation to what was happening in these centers of power. And with these revelations, we started seeing increased protests. And so protests begot protests. The police and security forces, of course, as has typically been the case in the region, or as we saw consequently, began using brute force to try and suppress the protests. And of course, there were also other instances where Tunisians began to either take their life or sort of imitate the act of Bouazizi. So there were at least a couple of other immolations. There was another circumstance where a young man climbed an electric pole. There were all these situations basically demonstrating the Tunisian populace's complete disillusionment with the status quo. So that self-immolation, once amplified on social media, on television, people started seeing it, we began to see a multiplication of those acts of protest. And when people don't have any, they have the resolve, but they don't have the platforms through which they can express their dissent and disagreement with political authority, the only thing they can turn to is their own body, like the sort of corporeal sense. And so the body became the site of protest for many people, whether it's in the form of self-immolation or using the body to go out into the streets and protest, or the adornment and transformation of the body, or the concealment of the body. There's so many sort of insurgent actions involving the body. So Tunisia happens, or I should say, like, the eruption of the protest movement swells and makes its way to Tunis, the capital. And before you know it, the numbers and the metrics are sort of inconsequential at this point. But suffice it to say that a significant proportion of the Tunisian population were, in one way or another, actively mobilized to and involved in the protest movement, which made it impossible for the ruling regime of Ben Ali to continue to either mask the circumstances or create propagandistic content to conceal the realities, including the realities of the protests themselves. So on Tunisian state television, there was content, being generated every day to showcase the fact that the streets were empty or there was nothing going on. And so with that, we began to see the incredible, contrast, if you will, between the realities as experienced by people on the ground and in the streets, and what the state was trying to propagate and reproduce in its own platforms. And so it just became a matter of time where Ben Ali would try his best to try and to bring people back, to get people out of the streets, if you will. If he couldn't use it with brute force, because even the security forces cannot match the incredible sort of burgeoning power of a massive popular uprising comprised of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. They're vastly outnumbered and ill-equipped. So with that came, attempts at reconciling or throwing a carrot to the public at large. So Ben Ali visited Bouazizi in the hospital. And this is a very famous sort of photo op that he took with Bouazizi sort of wrapped in gauze after suffering very deep and significant burns. So he's almost like in this mummified state, and Ben Ali is peering over him, sort of wishing him well and saying, you're a national hero or something along those lines. But those types of actions were not only too late, but they were largely out of touch with the reality. And it was fairly understood by the public at large that they were just a symbolic, tokenistic gesture that meant nothing. And so it didn't change Ben Ali's fortunes. So when he appeared on television and said, "I understand what you're saying," he said, "Fimtkum," which means "I get you, I understand you." He repeated it several times in a public speech, basically saying, "I get the message. We will reform the system." But by that point, it was the regime was beyond reform, which is where the birth of that expression, "Ashabi yurid isqat an-nizam," the people demand the fall of the system, which is a much more, I think it's more than just a regime, the fall of the system, and so there was no way to negotiate with that anymore. And so we saw the outcome with Ben Ali getting on a plane, flying to Saudi Arabia, and basically the collapse of that system, at least at the outset, it appeared to be the collapse of the system. So Bouazizi becomes iconic as people around the region, many of whom are living under similar political situations and economic circumstances, find inspiration, or at least see something that is largely out of the ordinary and very much at odds with the way they've conceptualized protest. So we begin to see immolations and protests of the kind. And I know we'll get into the rest of that, but this is the opening salvo. Backdrop being the existence of trade and labor unions who were very much engaged and active in civil society in Tunisia, and many of whom literally were the first to jump in and come to the defense of Mohammed Bouazizi in the rural areas, all the way until the syndicates in the major cities and elsewhere. So it became a real sort of national, and in some ways nationalist mobilization, because a centerpiece of the Tunisian revolution was also a pride in a different Tunisia, that Tunisia could, that this was not the Tunisia that people wanted to live under. They wanted a different Tunisia that represented the hopes, aspirations, dreams, and livelihoods of the public at large. And so from that sort of nationalist fervor came a very complicated nationalist fervor. It's not like a sort of completely unlike the sort of fascist, jingoistic, ultra patriotic nationalism that we see coming out of other places. It was a real sort of genuine commitment to transforming the institutions to mirror the aspirations of the public at large. And so that was, some of the pieces of the Tunisian revolution.
That's a wonderful intro. To take that further, a few weeks later, something similar, not exactly the same, happened with Khalid Said, and major uh, disruption took place in Egypt.
Yeah.
Now, before we move to talk about Egypt, which has its own weight, particularly in the Arab world, being the most populous country, and obviously its impact on what happens elsewhere is going to be felt quite immensely. There's been a sense always that, and it also, you can, to me, it's manifested in what was labeled as the Arab Spring, that nothing genuine happens in the Arab world. Everything is either is orchestrated by governments, or if the people do something, it is a copy of something else. Whereas really, what this shows and showed at the time, it was a watershed moment, how people have been struggling for decades and managed to, on different scales, but that eruption in 2010, particularly in these two countries, address this aspect of internal politics that has not come about overnight, but has been really addressed, and people have been trying to mobilize for years. So, labor unions that you mentioned and other organizations in Tunisia as well as in Egypt with Kifaya and others. Can you give context to those who thought and perhaps still think that Twitter and Facebook had the revolution erupt, as opposed to really organic elements that really have been working for decades?
This is a really amazing and very complicated question, because it has so many pieces of it that are, I mean, there's so much packed into this question, because on one level, it is there is a real there is and there had been a real problem with the literature about governance in the Middle East and North Africa specifically, because there was a tendency to assume and to operate on the basis that governments in the region and publics in the region are defined by authoritarianism. That authoritarianism is resilient, it doesn't go away, they accept it for what it is. It is more, it's almost, and there's also sort of a culturalist aspect to it as well. There's an Orientalist sort of culturalist aspect that, authoritarianism dwells in this region because it is befitting for these people. And that very little can and will change. And so with these revolutions, even if they were, even if they weren't successful, there was a disruption of the discussion around authoritarian resilience and the idea that there can't be anything organic to the region. The other sort of side of this coin is a locally or regionally generated discourse that critiques these protests and these mobilizations on the grounds that they are the product of foreign and Western infiltration that intends to transform the system of governance in their advantage or to their interests. The reason why both of those arguments are rather sort of defunct is because the outcomes of the uprisings in the region, in virtually every circumstance, disadvantaged those interlocutors. So the Western governments would not have benefited from the removal of Ben Ali, who is a very staunch ally, or the removal of Mubarak, who is a very staunch ally, or the removal of really of any of the governments, with the exception of Syria, right, where Bashar al-Assad was at odds. But nevertheless, even then, there was a detente developing between the Syrian government and the Western powers during that period, in the process of trying to reform and joining the world nations, if you will. At the time, you will recall that George W. Bush had defined Syria and the government of Bashar al-Assad as one of the axes of evil. So in leaving that sort of axis of evil, they had to make amends with Western sort of systems of socioeconomic market-driven privatization, which is exactly what he was delivering on. So to see that sort of change is an indication that the West wouldn't have wanted to see these outcomes unfold. Anyhow, but aside from that, without getting into the intentions of Western politicians and how they operate, in a very fundamental way, the protest movements in the region were largely organic because they were organized by individuals who were driven to protest by their respective predicaments, not because they were part of a larger sort of coalescing of complicated powers. The reason why the Egyptians protested against the police brutality in the aftermath of Khaled Said was because of rampant police brutality. I mean, it's fairly, it's fairly simple. And the ceiling of expectations and demands continued to escalate as the government of Mubarak proceeded to show a different face, sort of an uglier, more gruesome face, or at least what would happen in jails was all of a sudden happening in the streets. What was happening in these closed circles was all of a sudden happening in broad daylight. So all this to say that the protest movements, of course, are organic. That is not to say that there aren't attempts to infiltrate them. This is a very critical point, that any movement in the region, or anywhere for that matter, as soon as it becomes burgeoning and somewhat successful, there are attempts to co-opt them, to appropriate them, to utilize them in one respect or another. You will recall when, shortly after the success of the Egyptian Revolution, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton shows up in Tahrir Square to say, "Congratulations, Egyptians! We are here to support you. We're here for you." Same Secretary of State who exactly some weeks prior had said the Mubarak government is stable and it's going to be around for a while. Well, let's not get swept away by things, So all this to say that the folks who are sitting in State Department or wherever they happen to sit and are putting together all their game theory prognostications about how things are going to unfold, they are trying to determine which race to put their money behind, which horse to put their money behind in every race. And in some instances, they will put their money behind every single horse to see what happens. But that doesn't mean that organic grassroots mobilization that is demanding or asking for social justice, for bread, for a better livelihood is immediately and automatically tarnished. In fact, quite the contrary. It is by and large the state that is involved and engaged in direct sort of negotiations and treaty making with precisely those states. And so there is this sort of Janus-faced criticism. Those who are in the centers of power are busy meeting Western leaders and those who they consider to be, friends, but somehow adversaries. And the protesters, if they have a meeting in Sarajevo with a bunch of other activists, then it becomes, a larger than life, problem that won't go away. But anyway, going back to your original point, these mobilizations definitely disrupted the status quo interpretations and understandings of how we envision and think about the Middle East at large, and how we think about activism, political participation. And in some instances, political participation translated into electoral processes. Whether or not these electoral processes are airtight, successful, representative, that's a different story. But nevertheless, it translated into some transformation in procedural politics. But the organic activism, I mean, it has a long history, in fact. And I would not start at 6 April, 6th of April, or Khalid Saeed, or Kifaya. I mean, it dates far earlier than that. There's, the revolution of 1919, the protest movements in the run up to 1952. There's so many. It's a sort of organic, local, active community that is responding to the circumstances that they live under. So it should come as no surprise. There is absolutely nothing exceptional or essential about the Middle East and North Africa, including the countries that experienced the uprisings, that make them so unique that they are either not qualified to have representative politics, or that they are somehow best suited for dictatorial, sort of tyrannical governance. And of course, they're also not exceptional in that they have protest movements. The Arab Spring could have happened and does happen everywhere. Black Lives Matter protesters in the United States have a lot in common with protesters in other locales. So seeing the continuity of these protest movements and what drives them is really important. And to sort of shatter this idea that the Middle East and North Africa and the Arab countries are somehow strange or diabolically different, I think that's also something that needs to be challenged and debunked.
That's wonderfully said. And to the point that these organic movements, the what people in Tunisia or on the streets of Egypt shouted, they shouted for bread, freedom, and social justice. It's integral to all of these movements, which, like you mentioned, goes all the way back to perhaps even a century ago. History is dynamic. And even though I'm sure you teach your students, and it's all curricular history is dynamic, but that point remains to elude or purposely gets eluded by others to the extent that the there was a success that we all saw by the Egyptian revolution. Of course, revolutions are not necessarily meant and never happened in the history of humanity. That change and complete change takes place right after that. I mean, you can look at the French Revolution, you can look even at the American Revolution that everybody seems to be admiring for most of the times. It's a process. So keeping that process in mind, let's look at the socioeconomic reasons that have come to the build-up of what happened in Tunisia, and they're slightly different, but there are some common grounds with Egypt. And let's maybe, if you like to focus on Egypt, that's perfectly fine, and see what has happened running up to the revolution. And as you would like, as you analyze them, how you see these perhaps not resolving themselves, but manifesting themselves in what is going to happen next. So I'm not asking you to predict, but to analyze what will happen, because many of these socioeconomic underlying circumstances haven't really changed.
Yes. I think it's important for us to see the sort of organic circumstances that led to the protests in light of the shifting economic dynamics in the region. And if you don't mind, I'm going to zoom in on Egypt just a little bit, because even though those conditions are fairly similar in other locales, with a lot of caveats, to be honest, but at least it gives us a well encapsulated kind of case study. So Egypt has, for the most part, been extreme. And I'm not a political economist. I have to say this as a disclaimer. I'm not a political economist by training, so the details might be a tad sort of clunky or shoddy. But I think a lot of this information is fairly well substantiated by other researchers. I would direct people to Sam Suleiman's book, Autumn of Dictators, which I think is a really phenomenal work on the economic circumstances that led to these disintegration of the political system in Egypt in the run-up to Mubarak's toppling. But I want to say that in the circumstance of Egypt, we have a modern state that has, at least since 1952, has been procedurally consolidating power into the hands of very few individuals. That is not to say that the state prior to 1952 was not nepotistic and exploitative and highly centralized, but the creation of institutions with the intent of either delivering services, supporting subsidy, providing healthcare and education on a mass level to a substantial proportion of the population. All of these are extremely well-meaning policies, but as the system of governance begins to tighten around a small cadre of individuals, we begin to see the manifestations of that nepotism translate into socioeconomic corruption. And so between 1952 and 1977, 1978, we see sort of a burgeoning of this large, muscular kind of state. And of course, the state had a strong sort of revolutionary socialist dynamic. And then shortly thereafter, with Sadat coming to power, we begin to see a move towards free market economics and privatization of the public sector, gradual privatization of the public sector, and an attempt to diminish the subsidies that so many Egyptians living at or below the international poverty line were so heavily reliant on. And Sadat has his successes and failures in that regard, but then Mubarak comes along, and especially in the tail end of the Mubarak governance, we begin to see a very concerted effort towards moving towards the privatization of the public sector, removal of subsidies, the migration of services typically provided by the state, whether it's healthcare or education, into the private sector, rendering them unaffordable to the Egyptian public at large. And the concentration of capital into the hands of very, very few individuals. And this was happening in an extremely blatant and very sort of aggravating way. So at the time, the National Democratic Party of Egypt, the NDP, which was Mubarak's sort of platform, and really it was largely a one-party state for that matter, began to articulate itself as a party of entrepreneurs. And those entrepreneurs began to have more prominent roles in both within the state and in the cabinet, and they began to transform the state in their image, or in the image of their economic project. Very close to the American Chamber of Commerce, lots of sort of multinational investment in the Egyptian economic sector, including the agricultural sector, which is really critical, both the industrial and agricultural sector. Both of those began to suffer significantly as a result. When I'm just going to take a really quick example, the World Bank and the IMF, probably in the late 1990s, early 2000s, through their structural adjustment programs, began making the case that a country like Egypt needs to work to its advantage, meaning that rather than Egyptian government Egyptian fields, and these are the fields that birthed the ancient Egyptian civilization. This arable land around the Nile has supported civilizations for 7,000 years, but they had to move away from producing crops that would help sustain the Egyptian public, namely wheat and rice and various other things, and move towards much more expensive produce, largely for export. So rather than growing wheat, Egypt has to or should grow strawberries. And so long as there is a market for strawberries internationally, then there's a return. So Egyptian farmers all of a sudden begin to change their crops. Now, strawberry isn't part of the Egyptian sort of diet, nor are they affordable for the farmers that grow them. So what happens is once the strawberries Fast forward 2008, and you've got a global economic crisis. Global economic crisis produces a food crisis where food prices rise and people can no longer afford buying strawberries in the international market. So what happens? The Egyptian strawberry crop is left to rot in crates and not able to make it anywhere. So what happens to the farmers? Like you look at sort of the not the trickle up, but the trickle down. Like there's no money coming back to the farmers, and they can't eat. They can't. You can't live off of strawberries. And Egypt, because of the structural adjustment, becomes reliant on the importation of wheat from other countries. So rather than growing their own wheat, they have to import their own wheat. So they can no longer afford wheat. And what happens if a wheat crop season or harvest fails for climatic conditions in Russia? Then Egyptians can no longer afford, or the Egyptian government can no longer afford to feed Egyptians whose wheat and bread it subsidizes. So we begin to see the ills of this poorly conceived global economic system that was designed with the intention of advantaging all of these respective communities. Instead, it renders Egypt, and you have to think about this, is really mind-blowing. Egypt, a country now of 100 million or so, is the largest importer of wheat in the world. The Egyptian market for wheat is so substantial that Egypt is able to determine the price of wheat in the international market. It is not the most Egypt is, of course, far from being the most populous country in the world, but it is the most populous as far as wheat consumption. Why is that the case? Well, because the Egyptian fields no longer grow wheat thanks to the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and the IMF. So all of these things are part and parcel of how Egyptians in 2008 and 2009 begin to experience significant economic hardships with the incredible impunity of those in power, building gated communities, talking about how the economy is doing so well. The IMF has, not just passing grades, like passing with flying colors for the Egyptian economy. And we see, Mubarak increasingly sort of not distracted, but essentially excised out of the political system. He's based in Sharm el-Sheikh, living in the city of peace, a city of his construction that serves largely communities of wealth. And Egypt has this really fantastic outward-looking image in the world, while its populace struggles and suffers. And you can take that from the agricultural sector, apply it to the industrial sector. So the April 6th movement, for instance, grew out of the general strike called for on April 6th in support of factory workers in Al-Mahalla al-Kubra, industrial city in Egypt. And with that came a burgeoning of protests driven by workers, whether it's in the steel industry or various other industries, many of whom were underpaid and their companies were recording record sales. The steel industry in Egypt was literally one of the fastest and most lucrative steel industries in the world. And yet the steel workers had limited to no benefits, were being paid, in crumbs, essentially, not living wages for the most part. And they could barely organize. So they had to come up with complicated ways to extract any relinquishment from the owners and from the managers and from the shareholders of those companies. So we begin to see all of these things percolate together and converge in such a way, and then add to that police brutality and those various pieces and the Tunisian revolution, and you get almost a perfect storm, where the mobilization is not just rural, it's not just industrial, it's also professional. In the professional sectors, the syndicates of lawyers, syndicate of journalists are being, there's a crackdown against journalists and their inability to express the distraught that's happening in society. And you can see how interesting all of this is. And it's all organic. The few people who could speak English to the Western world or Western media and became sort of the connection to explain to Western sort of media entities what was happening in Egypt, they're a very, very slim minority. The majority of people are just individuals entrenched in their respective circumstances. And that is why this revolution unfolded in the manner that it did. People were mobilized for different reasons. Maybe they lost a job. Maybe they lost a parent. Maybe they weren't able to bury a parent. Maybe they couldn't afford to eat. Maybe they had a friend who was arrested or detained. Or maybe they felt bad because they saw an image of Khalid Said with his battered face, in the morgue. Whatever it is, it was all happening, and it was a really substantial mobilization, and people found inspiration in the action of others. In communication, I mean, there's a mass media theory called the spiral of silence, and the spiral of silence. I mean, this is a very crude interpretation of it, but it operates on the assumption that when we think that our opinion is in the majority, we are likely to express our views. When we think our opinion is in the minority, we are more likely to be silent, which sounds fairly reasonable. So if we are in 2011 today, and I had a revolutionary statement that I wanted to make, I mean, it fit into the parlance of the time, what was acceptable as a discourse at the time. So I could say a revolutionary statement. But now we're in 2020, tail end of 2020, where talking about revolution makes it seem like you are, anathema. Most people who in 2010, 2011, 2012 described themselves as activists with tremendous pride are now having to basically disown any and all connections to any mobilization or protest, and sort of retreat into whatever other sort of occupational things that they used to do. There were engineers and doctors who would say, I am an activist first, Now it's like, oh no, I'm a doctor. I know nothing about activism or protest. So all this to say that the circumstances of the time make it possible for some expressions to emerge. So people rising up in the streets made it possible for others to participate and to express their views and their anguish and their struggles. And that's one aspect of the spiral of silence. The other side is all of a sudden it becomes unacceptable, so you retreat back. It's not unlike what's happened in the United States vis-a-vis white nationalists, with Trump being who he is and the way in which he carried himself politically. He's sort of created a space whereby you don't have to be silent if you're a white nationalist or if you're a white supremacist. You can come out and say what you want, and there's room for acceptability of those types of discourses. So I think that also factors into how things or why things unfolded in the way they did, and why people were more inclined to say the things that they did in 2010, 2011, and the extent to which they were prepared to put their lives at risk when they came out to protest and to support a transformation of the political system.
I mean, absolutely. In revolutionary moments, the time is opportune. So, in this is an important point that is often missed. So, the nature of the revolution is fundamentally class-based, and the role of the lumpen proletariat, as well as the other layers of class in Egypt, have played a significant role that has not been given its due respect and due recognition.
Yeah.
How do you see, before we move into what happened in the elections and the presidents that followed and all that, how do you see that class dynamics? And I want to associate it with something else, sectarianism. How do you see that class dynamics evolving over the last decade in light of what happened in 2011?
And we're still talking about Egypt?
Yes, Egypt.
Okay. I mean, the class dynamics, unfortunately, haven't changed much. If anything, are you asking me to sort of transpose this to the current moment?
Please.
Okay. So, as sad as it sounds, the period between 2011 and 2015, 16, we had a real sort of genuine attempts at revisionist critiques of capitalism and a real attempt at rethinking what it means to move towards a more sort of equitable, egalitarian system of governance in Egypt. However, um, all of this has backfired in significant ways. The consolidation of power, the consolidation of economic reach, nepotism in various sectors, whether it's in construction or agriculture or industry, all and of course also in education and the healthcare system. There has been an improvement in the investment, the state's investment in some public sectors, but it is by no means sort of sufficient to warrant a real transformation. More importantly, as a result of the revolution, we began to see fairly contemporary manifestations of class division, whereby the working class are considered, and the poor particularly, are considered a threat to the middle upper class in Egypt. And I think the revolution has a lot to do with that. The fear of the rising of the masses again. This is almost like the boogeyman, if you will. There's often the articulation in Arabic that says "Sawdat al-Ghia," like the revolution of the hungry. And this is sort of like the red flags. Oh my goodness, the revolution of the hungry, people are coming to get us, And with that combined with rampant crime, which of course the state has an incredible ability to regulate crime, not regulated meaning that they're responsible for it, but through crackdowns, they're able to shut down crime. And if the police disappear from the streets, then you get kidnappings and you get these things and ransoms and all kinds of, whether it's petty crime or felonies, but nevertheless, there's the feelings of insecurity in the absence of the police. So it's almost as if the upper middle class in Egypt have now learned that they need to rush to the security forces to protect them from the raging masses whose sole conviction is to basically come and eat their kids or something like that, which explains why the vast majority of Egyptians with means have fundamentally migrated to gated, securitized communities. They've changed their living spaces in such a way so as to protect themselves from society at large, which is not uncommon and not unlike what has happened in Latin America, for instance, in Venezuela, in Brazil, in Bolivia, in Paraguay, various countries, in Mexico as well, over the years during the more sort of right-wing governments, neoliberal governments in the region. The advantages and the circumstances that were created to benefit the wealthy at the expense of the impoverished, and with the reduction of subsidies, you ended up having a very, very massive gaping hole between the haves and the have-nots, and there's nothing to reconcile that gap. So it meant that the communities with means had to protect themselves. So significant investment in security, and that's something that's happened in Egypt as well. Private companies, many of which are based in the West, are being hired to do private security for assets, homes, communities, businesses, industries, factories, you name it. So now there's a security industry, in Egypt. And of course, there's the state's investment in its own security apparatus and surveillance, et cetera, et cetera. But all this to say that the classes are now much more clearly defined. Now, factor that into also a cultural sort of distinction, whereby those with the means believe that they want to create an Egypt in their image. That has translated into an incredible sort of arrogance and antagonism towards Egyptians with lesser means and with less cosmopolitan / metropolitan, sensibilities. And so that is also a really critical part of this. sectarianism is a real sort of complicated issue in Egypt because while there is the assumption that the vast majority, I mean, when we talk about sectarianism in Egypt, we automatically or typically are referring to the sort of Muslim Coptic dynamics. You know, there are other sort of, you know, religious slash sect dynamics in Egypt, but they're fairly small and not insubstantial, but small in comparison. But with, you know, 8 to 12% of the population being Copts, and with political discourses in the country sometimes manifesting as a real sort of critique of anything short of Islamic kind of scriptural theology, the Copts find themselves largely at odds with a lot of, you know, situations and circumstances. At no point was this more obvious than in the aftermath of the toppling of Mubarak, with the Muslim Brotherhood in power and Salafis in parliament, where all of a sudden there was a real sort of clear questioning of whether or not they fit into the Egyptian social fabric and whether or not they are part of the Egyptian national project and identity. Which explains why there's a significant animosity on the part of Copts towards the Muslim Brotherhood and vice versa. So Copts are in that sort of, you know, difficult circumstance. But having said that, it's also really important to shatter the myth that Copts are by default wealthy. You know, yes, there are 3 or 4 fairly wealthy Coptic families like the Sawidises, for instance, but the vast majority of Egyptian Coptic Christians live exactly the same way that Muslims do. The areas in Egypt with the most substantial Coptic populations are actually Sa'id in Upper Egypt, the southern part of the country, and many of them are, you know, they live extremely simple lives, and many of them have had to deal with a substantial amount of persecution on the part of their respective communities because of their perception as more privileged or having a higher or improved status than society at large, because the church is able to provide some services or some charity or some support in some ways. So I think it's really important to really shatter this myth that, okay, Copts are Christian, Copts are wealthy capitalists, and, you know, the vast majority of the population is poor and Muslim. That is a really fraudulent and very, very problematic configuration, because it automatically translates into hostility towards Copts from communities that believe that they are part of the exploitation. Now, that is not the same as saying that the church today or Coptic Christian communities today are largely supportive of the political status quo in this moment because of its, you know, its antagonism towards the Muslim Brotherhood. That is not to say that it's equivalent. So there is no socioeconomic dimension to that. Copts are not in any way economically advantaged by the status quo today, in the same way that there was no circumstance short of, or since at least 1952, where Copts have been at an advantage. In fact, if anything, when you take like the Sawidises, they made most of their wealth in Libya, of all places, and brought their capital to Egypt and were able to position themselves in such a way to be influential. But having said that, they are not in any way representative of the vast majority of Christians and their circumstances in Egypt. So I don't know if I answered your question, but there's so many sort of intertwined pieces in this.
Absolutely, and you addressed exactly what I was hoping for. As a percentage, it's been well documented that the most, perhaps the poorest segment as a percentage of society are the Copts, and some of the poorest areas are the non-Muslims in Egypt.
Actually, do you mind if I add a quick point here? For many of the people who know Egyptian society well, this is not a surprise. But one particular point that I think can sometimes be startling and surprising for people is that in a city like Cairo, where the population is over 20 million now, the largest population of people responsible for garbage collecting and sorting and recycling are Copts in an area called the Zabalin. And there's also the Zaray. But basically, the areas where the people who sift through garbage with their own bare hands, most of those people are Christian. They're not exclusively, but most of them are Coptic Christians. So you can see, I mean, this is, and of course, if you know Arabic, you know that the word Zabel is a really it's a pejorative statement. Like when you tell somebody that they're a garbage collector, it's an insult. It's almost like a profanity. So if these people are doing literally the most menial task in the Egyptian hierarchy of occupations, then surely they're not doing well. And yet, despite that, there is a public discourse in Egypt that claims that those garbage collectors are wealthy, that they're making money off of people's garbage, and they're wealthy and they're doing super well, and they own towers and homes and mansions and all this kind of stuff. So I mean, their life expectancy is shorter than anyone else because a lot of them die of infection. And so few people really access these communities to see what it's like before deploying such outrageous accusations.
And to that point, that's exactly no. To that point, there is a deliberate dissemination of information that has been ongoing since the Sadat, as well as very intently during the Mubarak years, uh, uh, to try and also create further animosity on the basis of cultural or religious differences, and what contribute to that as well. And tell me how you like to address this. What contributed to that as well, to a great extent, is the many Egyptians who want to work in the Gulf states, and those who came back with Salafi concepts of Islam, as well as the very intolerant components that really Egypt has not known prior to the late 70s. But the government role seems to be intertwining, or has intertwined and continues to do so very well, with what the Gulf states and the spread of intolerant Islamic thought. How do you see that? I mean, we see the manifestation of it, but how do you see that potentially being addressed? How can there be some kind of reconciliation in Egypt with these dynamics?
So I just want to, before I speak to that question, I want to speak to a point that I think is quite similar and sort of the tail end of what you had just described. For our listeners who don't know so much about the sort of socio-political dynamics of sectarianism in Egypt, it's really important to note that it was during Sadat's time that the relationship between Copts and the state radically transformed. By effectively holding the Pope of the Coptic Church under house arrest towards the end of until the end of his life, essentially until Sadat died, or was assassinated. Doing so and effectively interfering in the operations of the church, he sowed the seeds of complete conformity on the part of the church. So it has been in the Egyptian state's interest to ensure that the Pope or the Patriarch of the Coptic community is the sole representative of Egyptian Christians, and that he is capable of reining them in to ensure that there is complete unanimity and conformity in opinion between the state and the patriarchy. So, and that is precisely why the church is now a mirror of the Egyptian state. There's a chain of command, and everything has to be like really well tied together. Copts that challenge the status quo or break rank from the church are considered either traitors or blasphemous or whatever else. And so the state was able to create the church in its image And there's no possibility that the Pope can be at odds with the head of state. Like the two of them are one and the same. In fact, Sadat appointed an interim Pope in the church. So the Sadat, who was then called the Rais al-Mu'min, the president,
Faithful.
the believer, the president, or like the faithful president. The faithful president, the Muslim faithful president, appointed an interim or acting equivalent of the Pope while the original Pope was under house arrest. So you can imagine like the complicated optics of all of this. But having said that, with the church kind of mirroring the state in some respects, it's impossible for people to really break rank or challenge the status quo. And it also means that if the church were to misstep, or anything that the church does, it's automatically, if it does something negative or problematic, it automatically backfires for Copts at large. So if the state were to do something, if the church were to articulate or say something that is largely problematic by the majority of the population or majority of the Muslim population, the Copts would suffer the consequences. I'll give you an example of that. When the Pope came out in support of the toppling of Mohammed Morsi in 2013 as part of a larger sort of coalition to remove him from office, in doing so, that was a signal to the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists that all Christians support the removal of Mohammed Morsi and the democratic elected government, which meant that they too are now political adversaries, which is why shortly thereafter there were attacks against churches. Lots of churches were burnt or attacked because of that signal. It's almost like they were trying to take the sort of Lebanese model, if you will, of sectarian governance and transpose it into Egypt, where the leader of every sect is the official representative and everybody is judged on the basis of their loyalty to this authority. Now, I want to move that to the transformations in Egyptian society as a consequence of movement to the Gulf. In the 1970s and 80s, with the slow collapse of the Egyptian economy or slow disintegration of the Egyptian economy, and with a very, very large and growing professional class in Egypt, because of the education reforms under Nasser, more Egyptians were doctors, engineers, legal scholars, and they were looking for jobs. And of course, with the development of the Gulf states, there were opportunities for them to work there. And so there was a real sort of substantial migration to Kuwait, the Emirates, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, where most of these Egyptians began to plow their trade and make a living in those respective places. It would be really naive for us to assume that living in a place doesn't affect us, that we retain our identity in every way, shape, or form. I've lived in Canada since I was 16 years old. I can tell you that there's so much about, or North America, I should say, so much about who I am that has been informed by this locale, many of which is antagonistic, by the way. But nevertheless, there is this, challenge of what it means to have your ideals and expectations. For many of those Egyptians who relocated to Saudi Arabia and other countries where society was much more conservative, much more defined by paternalism, patriarchy, division between genders and sexes, a real sort of redefinition of what it means to be living with people of a different faith. So the vast majority of Egyptians until the 1960s and 70s saw their as Muslims saw their Christian brethren as brethren, right? They saw them as people of the book, right? Today, this definition has shifted. It's now become mushrikeen, or people who believe in multiple gods or multiple deities, like polytheists, if you will. So those changes have happened as a result of an encounter with a different theological interpretation that was largely the status quo in countries like Saudi Arabia. So when literally millions, we're not talking about thousands, millions of Egyptians living in Saudi Arabia up until this current moment, but through decades of Wahhabi rule, and they come back to their respective societies, in their villages, in their towns, in their cities, they begin to see that a problematic dynamic in their locales. They begin to expect their wives to dress differently. Their interactions with family members and communities begin to change. The way in which they see their own, friends of a different faith begins to change. They begin to look at the churches in their neighborhoods as places of strange sort of rituals, and I mean, it's almost like a bizarre mysticism rather than a religion that they know very well. So before you know it, it sort of substantially shifts the relationship between Muslims and Christians in Egypt. And of course, there's a backlash in return. The Copts begin to see Muslims as naturally hostile to them, and you begin to see a real fear of like a Muslim kind of intervention. We start seeing microaggressions happening in society at large. Prayer microphones or call to prayer placed in front of churches so as to sound louder than the ringing of the bells, or to make sure that the Christians hear the call to prayer, or trying to strongly proselytize or invite Christians to Islam. And so all these dynamics become very, very intense, and they create hostilities where they didn't exist before. And that has, in my opinion, made it possible for Salafism to be an extremely popular, not just theological school of thought in Egypt, but also as a socio cultural dynamic, a real shift in socio-cultural dynamic. Nowhere is this more substantial and more obvious than in Alexandria, a city, coastal city on the Mediterranean, very European facing, was colonized by European powers at various points, and has always had a little bit of a sort of European cosmopolitanism about it. I'm not trying to essentialize it, but I'm just saying it has that sort of complicated history of cohabitation and coexistence between different communities, the Greek, the Italian, the French, the Anglophone, as well as Egyptians of various stripes and backgrounds, from rural areas, agricultural, effendis, like just a really interesting maelstrom of cultural complexity. It is also one of the bastions of Salafism, or has been for the last 15 to 20 years, because of the intent on the part of these Salafi groups to encounter cosmopolitanism and to challenge it. So all this to say that, I don't want to use language like breeding grounds, because I don't want to dehumanize Salafis because they're people. It's just a sort of a perception that maybe we may be strongly at odds with, but nevertheless, it has translated into a shift in Egyptian society. So fast forward to 2012, and you have the first parliamentary election in Egypt, and the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood are the most organized, and it translates into 77% of all the seats going towards Islamist parties. There's no other way to sort of interpret it beyond saying that in addition to the economic circumstances, there was also a real substantial ideological and social and cultural impact in the migration or sort of emigre labor force of Egyptians in those locales, in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere.
This socio-cultural element that you so eloquently addressed has been manipulated and also co-opted by Egyptian governments, including the current one. I mean, this week we've read about churches and Christian families in the Said and the countryside that have been slaughtered. So it continues to be the modus operandi of Egyptian governments ever since Sadat's time. And even though the Muslim Brotherhood is out of power per se, but that's become a continuing form. And again, to accentuate the point that you raised earlier, we see that although it's across Egyptian societies, but it's fundamentally and essentially happening in the poorer areas, people who do not have the means to protect themselves. And the government, yet again, does not present any kind of, not even a modicum of protection for those people.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you nailed it on the head there. I mean, it's unfortunately part of what the state has done all along, which is the idea of ensuring that there is an existential threat for the minorities that exist in the country, so that they continue to act in conformity, that they, that they toe the line, that they listen, that they behave, that they follow directives. And the same is true with non-sect groups like Nubians, or the
Yeah.
Sinai, what we call the Sinai Arabs, or communities, the Amazighi communities of Egypt,
Mm.
who are completely forgotten, in the western, who live in the western deserts and the oases areas. I mean, these communities literally have to demonstrate their loyalty to the state in every way, shape, or form. Lest they do that, the consequences are very dire. Thankfully, or not thankfully, but what the state has really perfected in when it comes to Christians is outsourcing the carrot and the stick as a way of sort of
Mm.
getting people to be compliant. They've outsourced the stick. The state doesn't have to punish people. The Egyptian Muslim society will do that job for
Yes.
them. So you always have to come to me for protection. So when you come to me for protection, you have to behave. You behave, you get my protection. You don't behave, you don't get my protection. You want to make sure that your church doesn't get bombed. You need the police officers outside, right? You need like armored vehicles. You need this. You need the protection. It's not unlike, it's kind of like the way the mafia works, right? But you need my protection. You pay up, and paying up is sometimes political loyalty, or something along those lines, because Copts at the end of the day also wield political capital. They may not have, I mean, in some cases they have economic capital if you're a wealthy entrepreneur like the Sawidises, but people like Sawidis will work with any and all governments, irrespective. Even when the Muslim Brotherhood was in office, the Sawidises worked with them. It really makes no difference, right? Because that's how capitalism
Yes.
works, right? But for the average Egyptian Copt, it's a little bit more complicated. So you have to ensure their conformity, and their social or political capital is at the voting stations. So when the state wants an amendment, or a referendum for amending a constitution to prolong terms of politicians, or if it wants elections, parliamentary elections, and it wants an increased turnout, bring out the Copts. You know what I mean? And
Yep.
so, unfortunately, it's almost like this kiss of death, right? Because if this current state is at odds with Islamists, right, and is deploying Christians, or imploring but also deploying Christians to vote and to do things in its favor, then it further animates them as an antagonist in the eyes of their Islamist opposition, which means that they will always be a target of Islamist anger and wrath. The Islamists, at least, that are oppositional. There are, of course, Islamists that are extremely, like, connected
Mm.
to the state, and the state is happy to deploy them in a much more sort of explicit way. But nevertheless, in a country like Egypt today, it is in the interest of everyone to be on the side of the state, everyone and their adversary. So it's a very complicated alliance. Like, the state today now has on its flanks the Coptic Church and the Salafi Party.
Yep.
Two of them in one place. They share very little in common. They're largely at odds theologically and ideologically, but nevertheless, they are part of that consortium. And so the state is able to rein them in and ensure that they deliver for them, despite their animosity. And each of them has one ear. So they each speak into one ear, and you play the role of seemingly an independent arbiter, you know. But when you ask Copts, for instance, today, like how their circumstances are, as sad as it sounds, and it's a testament to how difficult their lives have been for decades. Unfortunately, many of them will say, "This is our renaissance. This is the best time to be Copt," you know, in Egypt. And so, as opposed to a time where they were migrating in mass. I mean, we're talking about massive waves of migration escaping Egypt. Now, that protection, the state is delivering on some of its promises, because the church is delivering on its promises, you know? So it's almost like it's a marriage of convenience. And the same is true for the Salafis. The Salafis get their spaces because they're delivering.
However, on that point, uh, the state still possesses and exercises the greatest uh, uh, dissemination of terror on the people, because and you were quite eloquent in trying to see how it uses, let's say, Muslim groups or Muslim society by and large to try and take revenge at others, Copts in particular. But the state itself during the revolution, and perhaps the Maspero incident right in the revolution, when you had revolutionaries who were Coptic, I mean, revolutionaries wouldn't associate with any sect or religion per se, but when they were Coptic, they were the state was ruthless. There was no second measure in terms of how they dealt with the people at the time,
Mhm.
and and perhaps there's more than there are other incidents.
Yes.
So I'm not asking how you reconcile that, but we are in a state for a while, and this is a term that you used in a recent chapter, the neoliberal authoritarianism. How do you see that evolving and manifesting itself? And as a result, which is more interest to you and me perhaps, is how are people going to organize to be able to combat it, to face it, to perhaps defeat it one day?
Okay. This is the pie in the sky question, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I mean, I think to a large extent, sorry.
Again, sorry, the revolution did take place. It was not a
Yeah, yeah,
pie
yeah,
in the
of
sky.
course. Of course. No, no, no,
Yeah.
of course. Although admittedly, I mean, I'm sort of a student of Gramsci's, not of course not directly, but like as someone who follows Gramsci's writings and has been largely inspired by, you know, prison notebooks. His the way in which he thinks about and deploys the term hegemony has always been very attractive to me, because on one level you look at how hegemony works, and there is, with every wave of contestation of hegemonic practices, hegemony begins to perfect its ability to control. You know, it's almost as if, you know, the yes, the revolution was successful, and or there were some aspects of it that were successful, and there are positive outcomes. Absolutely, we are living through some positive outcomes of the revolution, right? And they may appear to be intangible, but they are real for some people. But there are also significant losses, and those significant losses, I would argue, are substantial enough to demonstrate that the hegemonic practices of the state, whether it's in Egypt or Syria or Bahrain or Libya or Yemen. I mean, Yemen to a lesser extent, it's a different dynamic, but in Tunisia, the state has come back with much more sophistication and much more sort of nuance and much more sort of wherewithal and capacity to employ its both its discourse and its narratives as well as its power, right, to ensure that the likelihood of a similar mobilization is minimal. And so when I look at, you know, neoliberalism today, you know, it's almost as if the state communicates this explicitly, right? It even says, I'm sorry, there will be no other revolution.
Yeah.
We're done. You know, in fact, we had a revolution against the revolution. How about that, right? So, so the revolution didn't. The January 25th revolution didn't work. The, you know, June 30th revolution is a correcting revolution. So therefore, what else do you want? You want the revolution to change the revolution that changes the revolution? Like, what? Where's this gonna go? And then so now the stability camp is very, very large, because the assumption is anything that disrupts the status quo is going to derail this infinite, seemingly utopian, transformative process. And I think it's really important for us to think about the public imaginary, right? So even though hegemony is getting muscular and states are getting better at doing what they did before, like look at the Syrian government, for instance, like Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad. I mean, there's there's no there's no limit to what it can and will do to consolidate and control power, and to bring territory into its jurisdiction, right? And it's doing so with greater veracity and with limited limited reach or capacity on the part of its adversaries, and is capable of accusing all of its adversaries of being terrorists, and so it's done. You know, the discursive simplicity that we are at today is such that the stability camp in virtually all of these countries is so much more successful at relaying the narrative that, I'm going to say this in Arabic, that if you لو تمشي جنب الحيط, it's better for you. Like امشي جنب الحيط, خلاص, you tried not walking next to the street, next to
Oh,
the wall, and that's what you got. Do you like the outcomes? Did it really work in your favor? What happened? And so you can basically see what the revolution means. Today, the term revolution is stigmatized. It is a problem. There was in 2011, every publication in the Middle East would celebrate the term revolution. Today, try to find anybody who wants to call themselves a revolutionary, who isn't either in exile or in jail. You know, except, I mean, I'm not talking about Iraq, of course, and Algeria. Algeria, Iraq, and Sudan are, the late bloomers, but the most hopeful. But
and Lebanon.
and Lebanon, of course, absolutely, and Lebanon. But as far as the Arab Spring and Arab uprisings of 2010, 11, and 12, we're talking about a very different and very complicated dynamic. So neoliberalism is much more sophisticated, much more muscular, and authoritarianism is married to it in a really sophisticated way. One way in which that has happened is through the media. The media today is and I'm not saying this as a deterministic argument to imply that, yeah, this was a Facebook revolution, or this was a WikiLeaks revolution, or this what happened there. Media is always part and parcel of any sort of political ambition and transformation. Everything from leaflets to smoke signals to to pamphlets to radio to television to Instagram, they're all part and parcel of the same thing. But today, what's happened is that the state no longer produces its own discourse. It, in the same way that I talked about the outsourcing of violence and security, it's also outsourced its narratives and its discourse construction and its political production to private entities. So in almost every country in the region today, especially the states that have experienced an uprising, they've outsourced most of their media production to independent, seemingly privately owned television networks that parrot the government discourse, and they look independent. And arguably, this is a product of something that the Western governments have tried to implicate governments in the region to do. They've said, oh, your media is so consolidated, it's so government controlled, you need to privatize, you need to expand, distribute the control of media to various other players and actors. So what do these governments do? They basically they set up companies, and whether it's run by intelligence agencies or run by militias or run by individuals who are close to both, or oil tycoons or gas tycoons, and before you know it, you have a media that looks incredibly diverse, looks incredibly sophisticated, but in reality, it is part of the same nexus, the same network. Whether it's politically at odds with another state is a different story. So you can have like Al Jazeera, which is basically run and operated entirely by the Qatari government, employs people from all over the world, but it is essentially run by the Qatari government. There's no questioning or articulation. I mean, it's like it is a Qatari state broadcaster. It's critical of other governments, but it is a Qatari state broadcaster. So other governments have done so with even more sophistication than Al Jazeera, where it actually does look like a private network. Like El Mayadeen, or the various other networks in Egypt, or the networks in Iraq, or networks in Libya. There's so many Libyan television stations, you don't know which one's which, but in reality, they all fall under pre-existing sort of political dynamics in each of the respective areas. So the media are a very, very critical part of being able to disparage people from believing that revolutions are possible. Most media entities are basically telling people, sit put, accept the current circumstances, because this is your best bet. And you want to see the examples of the alternative? Look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Yemen. Here are your exemplars. You continue to protest, you continue to challenge, you continue to rise in insurgency or anything else, and your outcomes are going to be infinitely more dire. So, as they say in Egypt, "Odu atbattu," sit down and become lame ducks. Okay, when you become lame ducks, you will fare better. And that is a very resonant, unfortunately, it is a very resonant message for a lot of people who are now either experiencing or have internalized a fraudulent experience of revolutionary fatigue. The idea that revolutions are not the way to do things. And of course, one of the problems with that is also the American example of democratic transition and change. So every time an election happens in the United States, it becomes a reminder that change happens through peaceful transition of power, which sounds like a very good idea. But guess what happens when the two polarities are identical, or you're actually changing members of the same party with each other? Then it doesn't become a peaceful transition of power. There is no transition when it's the same ruling party, class, individual, community, ideology that is repeating the same thing. So there is no real sort of inspiration for change at this particular juncture. It is now to leave on, or not to leave, but to just, I know you were trying to get me to say something somewhat hopeful, but I want to say that the public and popular imaginary is much more sophisticated than what governments think they are. So the image of you think about like the CCP in China, for instance. Yes, very successful at governing the Chinese polity, but guess what? They are absolutely petrified of the image of the young student standing in front of a tank at Tiananmen Square. That image is banned in China. You can't show it anywhere. The same is true of various other circumstances in our region. The mere image of an individual standing against power with absolute fearlessness is horrifying. It's horrifying. Just a few weeks or a week and a half ago, a young man, or a sort of middle-aged man, self-immolated in Tahrir Square in Egypt. Recent story. Now, of course, everybody looked at it as like, oh, he's either crazy or he's trying to do something. I mean, everybody gets what he was up to, yes. Right? Many people will accuse him being a Muslim Brotherhood or being problematic. It's just like, whatever. Not that it matters what he is. But the point is, because he's doing something that's been done before, it's almost like the system knows exactly how to address it. Like there's an existing it's almost like a flow chart. If yes, then no. Like there's a way to undermine and debunk the argument if you're going to do the same thing. But so now it requires a tremendous amount of creativity, of thinking outside the box, but also envisioning solutions that are organic, grassroots, and domestic, and also progressive. Because this is where I think the state doesn't know what to do. What happens when you are progressive and revolutionary? I mean, the state knows exactly what to do if you're not progressive and revolutionary. It knows how to which hand to slap you on. But so there are opportunities, there are hopes, but I think admittedly we have to be able to celebrate minor victories. And sometimes the minor victories are in the areas of like social freedoms, right? Even more so than political at this point, right? Social freedoms, or when a nonprofit organization is able to win a small court case in a district court in some place. Those are not insubstantial. They mean something, winning people over. But the public imaginary also matters. And we have an entire generation that witnessed and participated in the revolution. And you want to know that they know better because of the spiral of silence. They're quiet now, but they know better. and we're counting on them. What that means in the future, hard to tell, but nevertheless, they exist, and there's an imprint in their mind. Some of them might be here listening to us, but there might be other people who are listening to us going, this is all nonsense. What's a revolution anyway? This is the bane of our existence, or it destroyed the fabric of our society and all that stuff.
But human imagination has no limit, and in 2011 was not predicted.
Mhm.
What happened to 2019 in Lebanon or in Iraq was not predicted per se.
Yeah.
However, the same causes, mostly socioeconomic reasons for what happened before, are still there, and the reason why it cannot happen again uh, is still relevant. But
Yes.
the point that you make, there is there's a number of layers in what you've been saying, and of course, you're a Pezi optimist, as the great Palestinian writer has penned many years ago, Emil Habibi. Of course, there are reasons to be optimists, and we have to. And the current state is fairly dire. But the social dynamic that exists, for example, in Egypt, has influenced itself, has influenced many of the evolutionary political movements in the Arab world. I mean, people have learned from the mistakes, have learned from what has happened, and try to build something. There is and again, to take the point that you raised earlier about the Gramscian concept of hegemony, there is a counter hegemony that people understand organically and trying to work with. But what stands fundamentally against the will of the people and the ability of these people to organize is money and weaponry.
Yeah.
I mean, you can, and people have defied states,
Mhm.
but there is a state of of aggression that is exercised without any ethics. So, what do you do, and how much can you do in that regard when people are being pressed to have uh, 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 sort of civil movements, to have civil forms of organization? And I think Egypt has been a perfect example, because the labor unions, the student movement, the journalists, Kifaya, and all the others have been working for the last 35 plus years.
Yes.
Uh, and this is not necessarily something that's going to stop, because even this very week, the Egyptian government has launched an attack against what remains of the human rights organizations, and particularly المبادرة المصرية للحقوق الشخصية, the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. So there's still fear, and you can argue perhaps that this is prior to President-elect Biden coming to power and trying to exercise their uh, their control over the society, or genuine fear of what may happen. How do you see that? I mean, it's evolving, and the evolution of
Yeah.
these revolutionary fervent is not stopping.
I mean, I think you're right. You're absolutely right in saying all of these points, because the the existence of, I mean, we've talked about the ability of the state to instill fear in the public at large, and in doing so win and get conformity. But at the same time, the public at large has turned into the state's boogeyman, and the states are themselves afraid of what, individuals and communities coming together and seeing eye to eye, and building alliances might translate into. But having said that, the way the capacities are largely hindered these days, because the state is capable of launching these attacks at on all levels in multiple directions simultaneously, and to do so against everyone and their adversary. so as to shut down the possibilities of alliance. So, for instance, when the state arrests, members of or supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood, what are the chances that the progressive leftist community are going to come to the defense of the Muslim Brotherhood, detainees, and vice versa? What happens when you start arresting liberal, progressive, the Mubadala Musaya, the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights, for instance? This is an organization that promotes rights that in some cases might be at odds with Islamist kind of social cultural kind of interpretations. So even though they defend the rights of Muslim, of Islamists who are detained, what are the chances that Islamists are going to come to their defense? And when will that happen? What are the pre-existing conditions that would have to happen to render this solidarity possible? So in essence, the state is capable of operating with remarkable impunity because it was able to successfully divide. So it is conquering because it has successfully divided people. And the ability of coalitions to build makes things much more tricky. Having said that, the way in which communities, progressive communities that have a desire to change the socio-political and economic circumstances in Egypt operate is through grassroots solidarity, not representative solidarity on the part of the leaders and heads of things. So it's like, okay, so Gasser gets arrested. So is Gasser making is someone coming to the support of Gasser who is a top person in another organization? All of these things are great and they're symbolically important, but nevertheless, the real sort of groundwork that is happening is between individuals. And sometimes it is happening outside of our purview. We are not witnessing the real sort of solidaristic connections that are happening between people because communities have learned to be very much non-disclosive of their political expressions. So right now, there's a lot of pivoting that is happening. The state is also pivoting because it understands and realizes that there could be on the horizon, at the very least, some kind of shift in the geopolitics of the region. I mean, Trump is a very, very complicated figure because under his presidency, we had, the authoritarian governments of the region behave with absolute impunity because there was, you could do whatever you want. But there was also, and I'd hate to give Trump any credit for anything at all, but the total number of munition used on Middle Eastern and North African countries during his presidency was fairly minimal compared to almost every other president prior. So maybe he wasn't, gung-ho about regime change of his adversaries because he befriended his adversaries. It was a very weird sort of dynamic. But with Biden coming to office, and of course with his new Secretary of State being someone who supported the war in Iraq, there's no telling how things are going to be. There's no telling whether or not human rights as a narrative, an extractive narrative on the part of the United States against its allies and its adversaries is something that's going to be deployed. We have to remember that, in the same way that we think about, the United States has, I'm sorry to say this, I know we have Americans among us, but it is very rare that we have situations where human rights is a real agenda issue for Americans when they're dealing with a government that's an ally. Allies can violate any and all human rights, willy-nilly. There's no problem at all in that respect. The only time where human rights matter with allies is when it becomes a tool in the toolbox of the American sort of foreign offices and the Secretary of, and sort of the State Department to ensure that something that intends to unfold happens in a manner that advantages the United States. So it's not going to create substantial enough acrimony to turn into like regime change. But if you want to keep Mubarak in line, you let them know that your human rights activists are making the rounds in Washington, D.C. You know, you want to keep, all of your friends close. You make sure that they know that you're cavorting with their opposition, with the Muslim Brotherhood, and that's what you do. They don't like it. Mubarak government or these regimes or these governments don't like it, but nevertheless, it's also an attempt to showcase that America is open to different possibilities. You don't toe the line.
Yeah.
Well, there are others. There are higher bidders, and so that may be the reason why there's all of this commotion happening in Egypt, in relation to Trump's seemingly eventual departure and the arrival of perhaps a different approach to policy towards Egypt and the region under Biden. But again, it's hard to tell how this is going to unfold. What we do know is that at the end of the day, it is connections that typically works to advantage some versus others. Every political detainee that has been arrested in Egypt over the last 5 to 6 years who has been released was released because of pressure from Western governments in one way, shape, or form. So we know where power resides. That's unfortunately the way the arithmetic works. The Al Jazeera reporters were released not because they are Australian or Canadian, like it is because of the political sort of capital that is being deployed and the diplomatic relations between those two respective states. So what does this mean? I would like to know that the legal system in Egypt is going to effectively acquit the EIPR staffers, but I suspect that if and hopefully when they are released and acquitted, that unfortunately it will be as a result of Biden coming to office and the Secretary of State kind of like calling the government agent saying, come on, this is start on a good foot, release these folks, but not out of love for EIPR. At the end of the day, the Egyptian government does what it needs to do to ensure the primacy of American, the Pax Americana in the region. So in ensuring that, it stays. Nobody leaves unless they unless they challenge the status quo, with the exception of the revolutionary impulse. The revolutionary impulse really was a disruption of the order of things, which is why today the order of things is slowly returning. Like as they say in Arabic, the waters are coming back to their tributaries or back to their original stream. So that's sort of where we are. But it sounds much more pessimistic than I want it to. What I mean to say is the public imaginary is critical, it's vital, it's transformative, and people have longer memories than states.
It's wonderful, and thank you, Adel. Before I close and see if anybody has any questions, the call for solidarity has always been fundamental to many of these revolutionary movements, and particularly what we saw in Egypt. However, in the West, the progressives have also been quite moody in the way they present themselves as a solidarity movement, and really, it might some might characterize it as unfair, but fundamentally, they have not provided any meaningful solidarity to those wishing to fundamentally change societies, particularly in the Arab world, because of many dynamics, because of many complicated factors. Uh, what, how do you think this is going to present itself over the next decade?
I think there really needs to be sort of a meaningful sort of contemplation and revisionism, a real sort of sitting with ourselves. And by ourselves, I mean solidaristic communities in other locales outside of the Middle East and North Africa. We need to figure out, what does it mean to be allies, and what are the conditions to be allied to someone, right? If we want to be counter hegemonic in our critique, we have to figure out what the conditions of counter-hegemony are in those respective places. Some of the people that we have defined as allies are themselves criminals, you know, and I know it's really important. Sometimes it's problematic to say so, but we have to understand what does it mean to be on the right side of history. And so figuring out who our allies are, what makes them our allies, what conditions they work under, who are they backed by, who else, like if we are allies with a particular community or a particular group or a particular organization, we need to figure out if it implicates us in horrors similar to the ones that we are prepared to challenge our adversaries on. And that's, I think, the Achilles heel for a lot of solidaristic movements, including the left, which I count myself among. Like, we have to be able to critique the left's myopic view of regional politics, because it is operating on the grounds of purely ideological kind of, you know, bipolarities. Like, it's just, everything is a dichotomy. Where are you in this, you know, spectrum of left and right? Sometimes it's more complicated. And oftentimes it is complicated. Okay. And the lazy thing to do is to just say, oh, yeah, these guys seem to agree with us on this, and that's it. It's multi-sided, multipolar, extremely nuanced, and we have to be able to do the work. It requires a lot of work, and it requires a lot of caveats, and it requires a lot of disclaimers. It is not, it's not shameful for us to say, I support this group because they're being persecuted in this way, but I also oppose them in this way in these areas because they do such and such and such. It's more work, but it's true to our principles, our values as humanists, really, within the academy, and as independent interlocutors who really believe in bread, freedom, and social justice. You know, we can't support communities that are calling for bread, freedom, and social justice, but who are prepared to persecute and deny others precisely those things. So it is a lot of work, but it's work well done, or it's necessary work that needs to be done.
And these are wonderful words to conclude with. Adel, I am eternally grateful for the time you've given us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been really wonderful. Perhaps if anybody's interested in asking Adel a question, we'll take a couple of questions. You're more than welcome to send them, or to unmute yourself. And I think we've had well over 90 minutes, almost 110 minutes of conversation. So that's wonderful. If not, on that note, Adel, once again, thank you so very much. It's been really wonderful. And thank you to everyone who listened and watched us. And we will have another conversation with another comrade sometime soon. The next in the series will be with Professor Basil Salouh and Professor Toby Dodge on sectarianism and consociational politics in Lebanon and Iraq. That will be in December, on December the 22nd. Thank you all, and we will sign off now. Thanks,
Thank
Adel.
you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.